Bonjour, bonjour et bienvenue.
Hello and welcome to this meeting with the artists of Luminescence. It's an inspiring meeting for this creation initiated by the Royaumont Foundation with Amsterdam. And I'd like to thank the quai Branly musicians for welcoming us here in the museum this weekend and made this all possible. We have Amir ElSaffar, who's a singer, a trumpetist, a singer. He is also in charge of the artistic creation.
Gema Caballero.
We have Gema Caballero,
Vanesa Aibar,
who's a flamenco singer. We have Dena ElSaffar with viola, Josa, Lorenzo Bianchi Hoesch with electronics, Pablo Martín Jones with percussion. I'd like to tell everyone that you can ask questions via the chat function in YouTube, and we will respond to your questions towards the end of this meeting. The first question is for you, Amir ElSaffar. You are the artistic director of the project, which was born in the Abbaye de Royaumont, but it's not your first creation with the Abbey. So before getting more into the presentation of Luminescence, it would be great if you say a few words about the context of creation, of research, and of privileged meetings at the Abbey of Royaumont, which made it possible to broaden out borders. Now, in this particular context at Royaumont, did that inspire you for this creative activity?
Hello, bonjour, everyone. Nice to see all of you today, and thank you for hosting us at the Museum of Quai Branly. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. I'm sorry we're not performing live today, but I'm glad we can at least have this conversation. Yes, to answer your question, the project began at the Fondation Royaumont in 2015 was the beginning of the Luminescence project, but I had been already involved in the Transcultural Program since 2013. The Transcultural Program was begun by Frédéric Deval, who sadly passed away in 2016. But he began this program, I think, around the year 2000 as a space to allow for encounters between musicians and artists from different parts of the world in a meaningful manner that always had some question or some basic deep meaning behind it, more than simply just putting people from different parts of the world as we often see in world music contexts. He was very involved in an investigation, and in a way demanded of the artists that we dig deeply into our own resources, and also that we connect with each other in powerful ways. So I had already done 3 projects at Royaumont, 2 as a side collaborator and 1 of my own called Ashwaq, part of a larger project called Oración. And this was, I guess, the 4th project I was involved in, and this time as an artistic director. And Frédéric's mandate to me was to find a way to combine the microtonality of flamenco singing with some kind of harmonic context that would honor and reflect that microtonality. So that was the beginning, the sort of germ or the essence of the idea.
Alors peut-être un mot, Amir ElSaffar, sur le titre Luminescence.
Perhaps a word about the title, Luminescence. It's a beautiful title.
Peut-être traduire en simplifiant l'énergie libérée par la lumière.
Maybe you could translate that as the energy freed from light.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you've captured the essence there, and basically there are many ways of reading it. I mean, in some sense, I was thinking about Frédéric and his departure, which was very much in my mind, in my consciousness throughout the process, and the sort of release that happens as we transition from life to death. But I was also there's an idea in flamenco which I was reading in a essay by Lorca. About duende and the darkness and the sort of deep well of suffering and hardship from which the duende, or that effervescent, powerful emotion of flamenco arises. And I wanted to kind of create something that was contrary, not in a way to dismiss that darkness, but actually to in a way highlight it through the appearance of light. And I guess it also, for me, it's also a longer standing goal through music, is that somehow sound can reach to light. And of course, you know, physically maybe we have impossible barriers, but as the timbres and as the certain celestial type of harmonies emerge in the music, that there's a feeling of light that also accompanies the performance. So that was conceptually where I was thinking from the very beginning. In the process, this idea of light took on many manifestations. I won't go into them here, but it's something that I think we were able to bring forth through the sound, through Vanesa's movement on stage, and the way that Lorenzo processed our sound electronically on stage.
Alors, c'est vrai qu'il s'agit beaucoup de vibrations, de fréquences, mais aussi d'émotions.
There are a lot of vibrations and frequencies and a lot of emotions that are induced.
Vous êtes compositeur, trompettiste.
Amir ElSaffar, you are a composer, a trumpet player. You live in Chicago, but you're from Iraq. And you've cultivated these two cultures. You were playing in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, classical training.
Direction. Et puis vous êtes parti avec les codes de la riche tradition orale de la musique.
With the oral tradition in Arabic music, and more precisely the Iranian maqâms music.
Vous abordez cet instrument magnifique.
So you play this instrument, the santur instrument.
Alors j'aimerais bien que vous nous parliez de ce voyage.
I'd like it if you could talk to us about your quest.
L'une des clés de
because I think that's one of the key factors contributing to Luminescence.
Yes, so I'm born and raised in Chicago. I currently reside in New York. But in Chicago, where I received most of my musical training in classical trumpet, as well as jazz and blues. Chicago has a long-standing tradition and legacy in jazz and blues music, and I was exposed to many different kinds of music during my upbringing. But Arabic music, and in particular Iraqi music, or the maqâm of Iraq, was not present in my musical upbringing, or even socially. I wasn't very familiar with that music. I only heard little bits and pieces in family gatherings growing up. And I should also add, my father's is an Iraqi immigrant. He came in the 1960s, and my mother was a American of 12th generation. So me and my sister Dena as well, who's also in the Luminescence project, we're both of mixed origin, and I think both of us musically have been combining these origins. So not only how we lived in our upbringing, but also our own heritage. But I moved to New York in 2000, just after completing my studies in trumpet, and shortly thereafter I went to Baghdad in, I guess it was 2002, and spent the next 5 years of my life in a research of maqâm al-Iraqi. And the beginning of that period was in Baghdad, and then just before the war started, I left and went to Aleppo and went to Cairo and to Beirut, and eventually traveled throughout Europe seeking out masters of the maqâm tradition. And as you noted, it's an oral tradition, so you really can't learn it from books or from manuscripts or scores. It requires listening, and it also requires a direct contact with the teacher, this sort of transmission that happens heart to heart, as opposed to somebody studying in a vacuum. And I think that's true of any music or any discipline, artistic or otherwise. But in maqâm, it's really vital. There's something alive in that transmission that's necessary for learning the music and for being able to embody it, and for the music to become part of who you are, part of your consciousness and part of your being. So I spent about 5 years traveling and sort of living it from place to place, finding masters of maqâm, and eventually came back to New York, and in 2006 received my first commission to combine maqâm with jazz. And that really defined my musical trajectory for the next 10 years. I was kind of between maqâm and jazz, and with a little classical influence. And Luminescence was actually the first project for me where I reached outside of my worlds of, you know, the musical worlds that I've lived in, and began to encounter forms that are not as familiar to me. And so in a sense I had to learn as the process was moving forward, which was really something quite different and challenging, but I think the result was very special and beautiful.
Alors, en quoi cette plongée au cœur du maqâm
irakien vous a-t-elle plunging into the maqâm in Iraq, how did that help get you closer to flamenco?
Well, of course, there are two very distinct and very different musical traditions and forms. There are some common elements. There are many elements of flamenco that are connected to Arabic or the Islamic maqâm tradition through the occupation of Andalusia for 7 centuries that we're all aware of. But there's, at the same time, I didn't want to go too much and try to say, oh, this is Arabic music. You know, flamenco has many other influences that are not connected to the Arab world and that need to be honored and respected. I didn't want to only focus on the parts that I could understand that were familiar to me and somehow dismiss the rest. Quite to the contrary, my goal was to allow all the aspects of these musical styles to exist and to expand beyond their bounds. In the sense of the flamenco, how can the dance and the singing even go further than what it would in its normal context? How can I go beyond what I already know and what I think I already understand about music through maqâm and jazz? And so we were all kind of challenging ourselves in this process. And for me, the main key is the microtonality. And in learning to sing maqâm, one's ears become very attuned to slight shifts in intonation. In Western music, we're basically dealing with a 12 equal tempered system with 12 tones that are equally spaced. And yes, there are many examples of microtonal music in the Western tradition, especially in the past century. But that is the basic unit, is the half step. In maqâm, there are quarter tones that are much finer, and I would venture to say not only quarter tones, but there's actually a continuum of sound where there's no break between one sound and the next. So there's actually infinite subdivisions of a whole step, not only 2 or 4, and choosing consciously how to use those resonances in a performance through singing, through the trumpet, through the santur, or whatever other instrument one plays, is where you evoke the emotion and where the power of this music comes through. So when I came to listen to flamenco, especially when I could sort of take the guitar out of the context, either listening to certain palos that don't have guitar accompaniment, or just choosing to focus on what the singer is doing, I could hear many intonations much more subtle than the 12 tones that the guitar is able to impart. And singers are constantly doing this without necessarily giving a name to those notes, but I could hear them as maqâm pitches, or as relating to these pitches in between the notes of the Western scale. And that, I think, was what gave me access to hearing and understanding that level of resonance in a way that then we could reincorporate it in our new context with this ensemble.
C'est très difficile avec la trompette quand même.
That's hard to do with the trumpet.
Yes, thank you for noting it. Yeah, indeed. I mean, I have had to learn fingerings and invent fingerings that use the slides on the trumpet and kind of reconfigure my way of playing. And it took many years to get comfortable with it. And I'm still, it's a lifetime of work, because the trumpet is meant to be played in an equal tempered fashion, but we find ways around it.
Alors, vous parlez de cette émotion.
So you're talking about this emotion
dans la musique arabe, c'est ce
in Arabic music.
Le flamenco, c'est cette sensation.
In flamenco, you have that feeling of the subtle entry into trance. this kind of source of inspiration. So this feeling is quite close to many other cultures. Many cultures have words for that type of approach, but they all have their own codes. Maybe that's the difficulty in taming these various cultures together.
Yeah, precisely. In flamenco, it's referred to as duende. In maqâm, it's tarab, and in trance music in sub-Saharan Africa, it has another name. In the blues or in jazz, there's a certain, like you said, there's a certain trance that we enter, and I don't think it's the same emotion. I don't think it's exactly the same psychological and spiritual state that we enter, but it is something. It's a profound space, and that to me was kind of the essence that I was interested in always maintaining, and throughout different musical projects I've been involved in, to reach that ecstatic or trance or tarab or duende or whatever name we want to give to it. And as you noted, the codes are very different. So for me, an important part of the research for the flamenco was to actually go to Spain and to spend a lot of time in Andalusia, in the tavernas, in the concert halls, attending festivals, and absorbing not only the music but also the environment, and noting how people reacted to what the singer was doing, or to how the guitar player, how the dancer performed. That direct emotional connection, and the eruption of an applause or eruption, which you see in many different musical styles, but it's always something different. What evokes it in a tarab is not the same as what evokes it in duende or in flamenco, or what evokes that emotion in jazz or whatever other, or in an opera even, where people will spontaneously erupt in applause. There's some magical energy, and it's very powerful and very palpable, but it's also very difficult to contain, because it's, by its very nature, is uncontainable. But it's definitely something that we reach and that we connect to. And so I was trying to find the equivalents. Where do I feel that emotion in the musical styles that I connect to? So it's almost a translation, not of musical code, but of emotional or I don't think a code of trance is really worth trying to codify, but in a sense to find those equivalent resonances through the different musical languages.
Alors, avant de donner la parole aux artistes,
before handing over to the artists who are here with us, that are part of Luminescence, let's listen to the first of three excerpts that we're going to be hearing. This is from the Nîmes Festival. And great thanks for the pictures from Musique du Monde, who produced this.
Hombre maltrata y si la llaman ingrata es más dulce que la uva de la soca que hay en Cuba, es la mejor. Mi mulata.
Voilà, c'était le premier des 3 extraits que nous verrons ce soir. J'ai eu la chance d'assister à cette représentation et je dois dire qu'en voyant les images, les émotions restent intactes. Voilà. Alors Amir ElSaffar, est-ce que vous pouvez nous présenter les musiciens que vous avez conviés autour de vous pour ce projet?
I'm very sorry that the translation disappeared, so I was trying to get this to work again, but I'm not hearing it.
Est-ce que je recommence?
Yes, if you could just give a presentation of the various musicians that are with you today working on the project.
Sure. So who you just saw on stage, I was playing the santur. Dena ElSaffar, my sister, is playing viola. She also plays joza in the project, and joza is an Iraqi fiddle, violin type of instrument. Pablo Martín Jones is playing percussion. In that case, he's playing the cajon, but he also has a hybrid drum set that he has created. And Vanesa Aibar is our wonderful and very powerful dancer, who was in this case, she'll talk more about her process, but this was a piece that kind of coming more from the very traditional flamenco. We were translating it in musical terms. Gema Caballero is the vocalist, and who you don't hear in this clip, and I'm not sure if we're going to hear him on these clips, but Lorenzo Bianchi Hoesch, who's an extraordinary master of the electronic sound medium, and he was doing a lot of live processing of our sounds throughout this performance, and also creating his own textures that were actually a vital part of how the harmonies become recontextualized, these microtonal resonances that I described earlier. I'm not sure we're going to hear him on these clips today, but his contribution is extremely important for this process.
Alors Gema Caballero, vous êtes
So, Gema,
de Grenade, et vous êtes
you are from Grenada,
cette voix pure,
and you have this extremely pure voice and a great freedom of expression and a wonderful intensity. And you're also extremely charming and gentle interpretation. I also was happy to hear you in a recital in the Salle Vital with Luis Mariano. And that was another memorable evening. I remember that very well. Part of your career was devoted to song for accompanying dancers, and then you were a solo. You were singing solo. So how did you feel about this meeting and this working with Amir ElSaffar?
Bueno, hola a todos.
Hello, everyone.
Con vosotros y ver
wonderful being here with all of you, even if I'm just seeing you on tiny screens. I'm very happy to be participating in this event, and I'm also very happy to have seen the video. This has been a wonderful production.
Porque para mí era
For me,
novedoso.
it was something novel.
No conocía la música.
I was not aware of Amir's music, of the maqâms. I had not worked with the instrument that we call the santur. It was a very enriching experience. I learned a lot. And also, I was able to get to meet new people. I knew my friends from Spain, but I met Lorenzo and Dena. They were really wonderful companions, and it was a very beautiful experience to start from nothing and to build it up slowly. It was a new sound for me. It was new working with electronic music, for example.
Fue un proceso muy bonito.
It was a very beautiful process, in fact.
Comment vous dites, j'ai créé à partir vous avez entièrement, c'est qu'une création absolue.
This was an absolute creation. You didn't start from any traditional songs that you reinterpreted. You created from scratch this particular repertoire.
En mi caso,
yes, in my case,
con el flamenco tengo unos conocimientos.
I do have some knowledge of flamenco, the palos of flamenco, but when we came together, we had the musical directors, Amir's main idea that he explained, but it's true that we didn't know each other. So we started this process. We didn't know each other. We didn't know. I didn't know his music. We didn't know what we were going to come up against. So we had to get to know each other and start looking at researching how we're going to bring all of this together, how we were going to bring our knowledge, my knowledge, the knowledge of others together. Space started in Spain, and together we thought of many things. Some were useful, others weren't, so we had to find something else. But I think that I've enjoyed this enormously, and it's a very, very precious moment.
The microtonalities of the Iraqi maqâms is something that wasn't really that foreign to your culture.
No, como he dicho, yo no conocía.
No, as I said, I had absolutely no knowledge of maqâm or of the microtonalities that Amir spoke of. What I did understand was that his music could be very close to have an affinity with flamenco, that we could really work together. To me, that was very surprising, especially because I had never worked in this way. And also because while it is true that there are some affinities, but there are also many differences, and we were able to easily find what it took to make the connection.
It's also your natural curiosity that really gives the wealth of opening of your spirit and your musical culture that you have, so that it made this new creation as rich as it is. The presence of the dancer, Vanesa Aibar.
Parce que finalement, vous avez retrouvé pratique de chanter.
Got back to the practice of singing for dancers.
Vous avez abordé la présence de
How did you deal with the presence of Vanesa? How did you work with her?
Bueno, con Vanesa ha sido fácil. Digamos,
it was easy to work with Vanesa.
Yo nunca habíamos trabajado juntas.
We had never worked together before, but we already had a common language. This is what happens in flamenco. Even though the artists don't necessarily know each other, they understand each other. And if she explained that she wanted to do such a palo or such a dance, we understood each other easily. The beautiful thing about her work was being able to find that connection that we needed with Amir and with Dena, with those instruments. Perhaps with me it was easier because the language between us was easy for us. We understood each other.
Alors, je vais m'adresser à Vanesa.
I'm going to speak to Vanesa now. Vanesa, you are the mounting star in flamenco dance today. We've seen you in the Yerba Buena company and as a choreographer. So you transcend traditional forms. How did you deal with this project as a dancer?
Hello, good afternoon. It's lovely being here with you, and also lovely seeing all of my colleagues. It's lovely to see you. Well, my approach to the project was a rather simple approach. Amir called me, asking me to collaborate on this project. He had seen some of my work, so he was very aware of my vision of flamenco, how I approached flamenco. So in fact, things were rather easy. I was given the freedom to be able to integrate this as a different element, a different sound element, and a different physical element.
Alors, vous incarnez le rythme, le mouvement, mais aussi...
So you incarnate the rhythm and the movement, but also waves, because it is a full show. There are elements that were new for you.
Sí, sí, sí. Bueno,
yes, indeed.
El primer elemento,
the first thing was maqâms music.
Amir con el instrumento, con el santur y la yosa
Amir's
de Dena,
singing and
y alrededor de eso
the mixture of instruments and Dena's contribution. And when you're dealing with very traditional music, but also electronic music that was manipulating our sound, and that was very novel for me, completely unexpected.
De vous regarder à nouveau.
Out of the ordinary.
Let's have a look at the second excerpt from that evening production that was recorded at the Flamenco Festival in Nîmes, France.
Un extrait donc de
An excerpt from Luminescence
danse de Vanesa
with the dance by Vanesa Aibar.
Nous commentez cet extrait, Vanessa.
Could you comment this excerpt, please?
Mira, este extracto forma parte de la
That excerpt is part of Seguidilla, the introduction we did for this number is a series of improvisation. So it's you have the main phrasing and then the responses from the trumpet. And we came to the agreement that we were going to play. And this is what we did with Amir. So we did, we improvised sort of that interaction between the dance and his trumpet. I just remembered that this is one of those moments where you connect with your fellow artist, where you're very open and you're very attentive to the other. That for me was that highlight, that moment with the trumpet. That was a gift for me. That was a way I connected with him, and of course also with Pablo.
Amir ElSaffar, vous voulez rajouter quelque chose concernant cet extrait?
Amir, would you like to add something concerning this excerpt?
Yeah, this was one of the, the challenge for me here is that there's the Seguiria rhythm has a very particular language and code to it, And so at the very beginning, I was trying to somehow learn phrases and listen. I was listening to guitar players and vocalists and how they were relating to the accent pattern, and eventually realized that I was much better off to just rely on my own intuition and relate to it the way I do as a, you know, musician of a jazz background, rhythmically more from a jazz background, and melodically coming from the maqâm. So I'm kind of combining those sensibilities, and I think this is an important point in these transcultural processes, is when you try too hard to learn the other's language and try to incorporate it, oftentimes you can get off center or lose your own sense of who you are or your balance. And I found it's much more effective to simply play genuinely to who you are and to express yourself freely in that moment. Otherwise, you're attached to an image of what you think the other is, but you don't necessarily know, not having lived through it. So this was an example of, you know, the only way for me was to liberate my own sensibilities and then just, you know, listen to Pablo's sound and Vanesa's feet, but also to her movements, and sort of surrender to that moment every time, and to forget or lose who's from what tradition, what language are we speaking, and just exist in the vibration and in that fast rhythm of the moment.
Est-ce que dans le cadre de cette écriture et improvisation,
in the framework of this writing and improvisation, is that possible?
I think it's. Did you say writing?
Je peux dire que dans le cadre de cette
the framework of this creation,
pour l'improvisation,
is there room for improvisation?
Yeah, I think improvisation is at the core from the very beginning. Eventually, we spent 10 days in Royaumont, and I think it's a miracle that we were able to put it together in 10 days. Had we had a month, you know, it could have been even. There's more that we were ripe to explore, but we basically would get in the room together and improvise every day. And it's a very unsettling process, especially when you know you have a premiere 2 weeks away and you're going to be in front of a public. You know, it's a vulnerable state to be in, and that presented a lot of challenges during our process. But the improvisation, you know, maqâm is an improvisational form, obviously jazz, flamenco, and Lorenzo's approach to electronics is also improvisation based. So for me, if I were to have arrived on the first day with scores or exact directions, I don't think the result would have been as interesting. My goal was to allow each person to express themselves to the maximum extent. And so that really comes from the freedom of improvising in each moment. And eventually, after, you know, a week of working 6 to 8 hours of rehearsing together, plus the hours that we all spent individually, long into late nights at Royaumont, we started to then set, okay, this is the sequence. So at least we have a framework. But even inside of that framework, there's a lot of malleability, there's a lot of room for change. For me, the project is alive as long as there's space for it to change. When it becomes very set, that's when it starts to lose some of its magic. So I think in every performance, there's elements of unknown that we all step into, and then we all have to carry each other through this process and connect to and trust one another.
Alors, je voudrais m'adresser, merci Amir. Je voudrais m'adresser
Thank you, Amir.
Pablo Martín Jones.
I'd like to talk with Pablo Martín Jones, who's a percussionist,
guitariste flamenco et d'une danseuse flamenca.
And our guitarist and dancer. As was the case for all of our artists, your musical world evolved over your career, but flamenco is really the main source of inspiration. So I got to ask you the same question, Pablo. What did this creation, in essence, bring to you? Did you discover?
Bueno, primero, hola François, muchas gracias por tenernos hoy aquí. Hola a todos mis compañeros. El
Maqâm, I had no knowledge of it. I had some knowledge of Arabic music, of North African music. I didn't know that maqâm had its own identity, that it was special.
Pues una rama más de la música árabe, pero en fin, la música árabe es un universo enorme.
Thought, it was one more branch of Arabic music, but Arabic music is a huge universe. So it was rather very special to learn, but also to learn from Amir was very special.
Es desde un lugar muy especial, muy libre.
Because he, in fact, creates a very free atmosphere. As he explained, he comes from a very hybrid perspective when it comes to music. This, in fact, opened a door, and at the same time, I found myself listening to something yet again, in fact, that I had been listening to many years, but listening to it in a different way. Perhaps I had this listening in a very archaic way, listening in ways I had done with my musical journeys, which is a new way. And also it's interesting to see what this had in common with the flamenco and what it didn't have in common with flamenco. And at the same time, you're trying to establish bridges between both musical styles.
Alors, c'est vrai que Camarón,
it's true that Camarón and Andalusia and others have shown the way, have shown the path. And there's a real mixture. So why does flamenco go so well with so many different musical styles?
Bueno, el flamenco se adapta muy bien.
Flamenco adapts very well because it is an art form that is not written. It's been influenced by the presence of the Arabs in Spain, by the presence of the Jews in Spain. It has very influenced by sub-Saharan African. It's been influenced by the Americas, by Europe, and that because of where Spain finds itself on the world map. If you look at Spain, you can get a pretty good idea of just how permeable flamenco has been musically. And of course, the influence of the gypsies and of their fascinating way of understanding music, which led them on the path that they took. And I think that is what gives us this incredible character.
¿Por qué no una experimentación más al final?
So, to us, this is just one more form of experimentation. And this is what generally happens in music. Perhaps a bit more with flamenco because it's much more mixed. It's not that it adapts better to change because there's always resistance to change, or some people are more reactionary than others. But in the end, music is music. And music is never just one way, one fashion. And the only proof that something is good is that it lasts throughout time. And we'll see if these experiments will be long-lasting.
Merci, Pablo.
Thank you, Pablo. I'd like to hand over now to Dena. Good evening, Dena. You were saying earlier, Amir was saying you're my sister, and you're also born in Chicago, and you've also followed your own path leading to the maqâm.
Nice to see you. And I'm really happy just that we can join together, even if it's just on the screen, but I feel our hearts are together. So thank you. And it's just been such an honor to be part of this project. I have to say, when we talk about the way we created it, I remember it and then my heart starts to go faster because I remember it was such an act of faith or something, like all of us just reaching and believing that we were gonna find a program together that was gonna make it represent everybody's strengths, as well as this collaborative creation of something completely new. And I was very, I don't know, like so feeling very alive by the process. Just, it was never boring. It was always just listening, thinking, and processing. And I don't remember what the question is, but I'm just sharing a little bit of my memory of the project.
Alors, de quels instruments vous jouez au sein de ce projet?
What instruments do you play?
I play two instruments, the viola and the gyoza. Now, many people think it's a violin, but I like to make a point that I play the viola because it is it's kind of in between the violin and cello, and it really does sometimes sound more like a cello, in my opinion. It has this rich, deep sound. That's my sort of original instrument. And then the gyoza is actually an ancestor to the violin. It's a much older instrument, and it's made out of a coconut shell, as well as it has something that's the pericardium of a water buffalo. But then other than that, it has 4 strings, and you hold it on your knee and play it with a bow, similar to violin, but it has a very different sound, and it's an important traditional instrument for Iraqi maqâm. And I began playing the gyoza almost 20 years ago now, as a sort of reaching deeper into the Iraqi tradition. I was playing violin and viola, of course, but gyoza has a very unique voice that sounds very ancient and very authentic.
Alors pour vous qui êtes reparti
For
aussi
you,
sur le chemin
who went back on the path of your ancestors,
transmission est quelque chose d'extrêmement important.
Transmission is something that's very important for you?
L'enseignement
His traditions and teaching?
Yes, very much so. I think for me, it was a path of self-discovery, being a child of an Iraqi father, living in the United States and trying to understand, who am I? I remember people thought I was Italian or Greek or whatever. It's just took me a long time to understand my own tradition. And with music, it was much more authentic for me to approach this part of my culture through music. And at the same time, I wanted to just create the spirit of this music in the United States. I mean, I know that other people do it as well, but for me, it was an important mission because I thought about children like me growing up right now, and I want them to feel more clear about their music and their history and ancestry. So my playing Arabic music in the United States is very much, I love it, but it's also it's got a bigger goal to create this strong cultural importance and something beautiful that people can be proud of.
Donc, à l'inverse de tout le monde, vous êtes allé vers le
Contrary to other people, you went towards flamenco. And the other artists went from maqâm, but you went towards flamenco. So ultimately, it was quite familiar for you?
No, flamenco is something I've always admired since I was a child, and I first heard flamenco music on a record. I loved it and wanted to understand more, but I feel this project was a huge education for me, although also I am understanding that I have a lot more to learn about flamenco, but I feel much more inside of it now than ever.
Alors pourquoi avoir choisi ces 2 instruments précisément?
Why did you choose those 2 instruments for this creation?
Well, I actually did not choose those instruments. My brother, Amir, who is the leader of this project, he asked for these 2 instruments because the gyoza is very evocative of Iraqi maqâms. So that's really representing this tradition, and it's a sort of important, along with the santur that my brother plays. those are two traditional Iraqi instruments, but the viola is more like a cross. It's almost like holding the space for everything else. Sometimes the viola, I do something very simple on it, like one note. Literally, everybody's doing all these other things, and I'm just creating something to like bring everybody together. I don't know. That's how I see it.
Merci, Dena. Alors, je voudrais m'adresser maintenant à
Thank you, Dena. I'd like to speak with Lorenzo Bianchi Hoesch.
Terminer de m'adresser à vous, Lorenzo, parce que
I wanted to finish with you because you're a composer.
Italienne.
You're Italian.
Vous travaillez justement sur le
and you work on sound and space and the world of electronic sound.
Au moment où Amir vous propose
Amir proposed to work on Luminescence.
Vous sortez d'une résidence à l'IRCAM.
You were at the IRCAM doing research, I think, at the time. So what was going on when he talked to you about this project? And what did this project represent for you? How did you to move into it?
Bonjour à tous. Alors, Amir, moi, je l'ai rencontré à Royaumont sur un autre projet précédent.
I met Amir in Royaumont on another project before, where he was a singer and he played the trumpet and the santour. And we already had done a project that wasn't well known, but it was kind of well known. And so he knew my way of doing electronic music.
Particulière, on va dire, parce que c'est
my unusual way of doing it, because it's really a lot based on improvisation.
Assez expérimental. Donc,
it's kind of experimental. So when he asked me to participate in the project,
et je crois que ça, c'est un peu.
I think it touches upon, everybody was kind of in the same case. What Amir did and the great work that he did in the project was casting. And that's why it worked. In 10 days, we were able to build something, to put something together, because everybody showed up with their own baggage, and they had to get into a resonance with everybody else. But Amir never asked people to do something that were outside of their own sensitivity. So when he asked me to participate, he first asked me to participate as an electronic improviser, to bring in, to contribute, to kind of sort of as an eye open on the contemporary world and the experimental world, and also to use spatialization of sound that I can handle. And he knew that because we'd already done projects of this type with a lot of loudspeakers. So he asked me to be myself, basically. So it was easy to accept.
Justement, expliquez-nous un petit peu comment vous avez travaillé sur cet espace.
Could you explain how you worked in the space and what tools you used? What were the colors, as it were, electronic colors that you used? Well, the tools, I designed and produced the tools. So I have built my own software, developed my own software.
Moi, je connaissais très peu de la culture.
I didn't know maqâms and flamenco culture. I lived in Spain for a year, so I speak a bit of Spanish and I know a little bit, but it's not really where my musical research was orientated. And the role that he asked me to play was a role of not of composition, but of interpretation.
Et moi, j'ai interprété ça comme.
I interpreted that. I feel a bit like a electronic sounding board of all of the acoustic instruments. So I built duos, more or less, with all the musicians, and in moments where we're together. So I almost never had to inject anything. I was I recover sound, everybody's sound, I pick it up and I transform it. So it was complicated for them to understand the way you change the timbre of the sound and to play with it. It's something that people don't know much about. Musicians have their own instruments and their own sound usually, and they have their pedals or whatever they use, whereas here, they had to give me their sound or their and that was really a close collaboration. So there's a lot of interplay.
Vous êtes très sensible à ce que vous
appelez la relation son. You're very sensitive to the relationship between sound and space. Exactly.
C'est pour ça, je crois qu'en fait, Amir m'a.
That's why I think Amir asked me to participate.
C'est cette partie.
It was that whole aspect.
Très basé sur les paramètres.
It's really based on the parameters of space, which I adore, especially on a stage, because I find that it gives a whole different impression of the music and the show on stage. And I think that where we all met together, it was the same point, where Amir and Gema,
porte d'entrée qui a été la microtonalité.
It's kind of the microtonality. That was the entry.
Moi, j'utilise aussi autant
the door of entry, and that I use that when I compose as well. And it's very fertile for electronic music because it is a continuous space. It's not tempered. You create it tempered because you put it into that kind of space. But it's not in a Hertzian space, it's a linear space. And you can pick that up without imposing notes, specific notes, by listening to the sound that was coming in, and that was microtonal by definition.
Leur création, en fait.
Because that's where it was created. And so it was quite easy to get together. Another musical parameter that I worked on was the rhythm.
Donc beaucoup avec les.
Working a lot with Vanessa's dance.
Et aussi avec Pablo.
And with Pablo as well. So I find that my role was there in rhythm and microtonal harmony.
Que j'ai fait devenir beaucoup plus spatialisé. Et
that I added a spatial aspect to that. Thanks, Lorenzo. Amir ElSaffar, you are the artistic director of the project. Would you like to add something?
Well, the only thing I would like to add to both what Lorenzo and Dena said is one of the key aspects of this collaboration is that we're missing an essential component of the flamenco, which is the guitar. So we have the voice and the dancing and the percussion, the emphasis of the rhythmic aspect, but the harmonic space that the guitar creates is absent from this project. And that was, in a sense, how the project began from Frédéric Duval's first commission in 2015 for this work. So a lot of what Lorenzo is doing, also what Dena is doing, and to some extent myself, especially on the Santur, is to imagine an alternative space. How can we fill that? And it's not an arbitrary question because, for one, the guitar has equal tempered harmony, which we're trying to break free of, and well, we'll leave it at that question alone. So how can we imagine a harmonic space that's microtonal and that's also that we're not losing something. We don't want to be suddenly stripped of the power and the beauty, but we want to create something different. So for instance, the viola, as Dena mentioned, can be a melodic instrument. It can be more of a bass, or it can be somewhere in between. And her particular sound, I have to say, I'm always disappointed in other violists because I'm used to Dena's sound, where she can play what sounds like one note, but you actually have a very, very wide spectrum of tones above it. It's something that Dena has that she's maybe not even fully aware of, because it's just natural to her. And the Jose also is a harmonically extremely rich and has many piercing overtones. So when you combine those with Lorenzo's processing, who can then spatialize not only in the room but also harmonically in the different spectra, we end up with a very rich and powerful, and it's something, a sound that really goes down into your physical sensibility. So that was kind of just to synthesize and tie together how Lorenzo and Dena's roles were really vital to merging these worlds in the spatial sense.
Je voudrais saluer aussi Vincent Mahé, qui n'est pas avec nous, mais qui a travaillé sur le son.
I would like to salute Vincent Mahé, who worked on the sound. He's not with us today, but he worked on the show with Amir.
Yeah, Vincent has been a pillar, has been essential in this project, also in previous projects that I've done in Royaumont, and so he's responsible for delivering that sound to the space and to the public.
Alors, je propose qu'on regarde le dernier extrait.
So let's hear the last excerpt of this evening's proceedings in Luminescence at the Nîmes Theatre in the framework of the festival. Let's have a listen.
C'était le troisième et dernier extrait donc de
That was the last excerpt of this evening from the festival in Nîmes last year. I'd like to ask Vanesa to comment on that particular moment. Vanesa Aibar.
Okay. Vale, ¿ahora? Sí. Bueno, pues esto forma parte del primer número que...
This is part of the first act that we interpreted together. It's a mixture of fandangos and a traditional maqâm form. To me, it was a difficult number because we were integrating two very different rhythms, the rhythm of the fandango and of this other style. And I was used to using, rhythm at 12. It was rather difficult, I must confess, but it was also very amusing to be able to find learning in conflict.
Como veis, es muy, tiene su parte muy folclórica.
You can see part of this the act is very folksy. It's very folklore. It's festive.
Como introducción por parte de Amir, porque fue como.
And I think it was a good introduction chosen by Amir. It's one of the numbers we really had to work on a lot so that we could be cohesive and coherent.
Merci, Vanessa.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Gema, le même exercice.
Could I ask Gema the same question? Could you comment this particular moment?
Bueno, sí, yo recuerdo ahora que lo comenta Vanessa, que sí que fue...
Hearing Vanessa, I remember...
Un momento creativo más...
I also remember that was a very special, creative moment. I contribute, in fact, the more folklore part of the flamenco, the fandango. It was very beautiful to have to take into account both of these rhythms, the maqâm rhythm and go from pam, pam, pam to our own folklore. I think it came out very well-rounded, very pretty. And I like the way Vanessa foretells what was going to happen later on in the show.
Merci, Gema. Alors,
thank you, Gema.
Est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire
Dena, could you talk to us about what you were doing?
Oh, okay. So when I watched that excerpt, my heart rate is up because for us, it's like we're watching, listening, paying so much attention. And this is to me, the part of the performance that we must practice no matter what. This is a top priority that we have to practice this ahead of every performance because it's the most difficult to make it work. If it doesn't do exactly right in the right moments, it's like it's destroyed or something. Like so much pressure. There's many moments in the show where we feel more like improvisation. This does not feel like improvisation, and maybe for some people, but for me, I'm watching and I'm praying. But I love it. It's so I love to see how successful we were in this performance. It makes me feel very proud.
Merci, Dena. Et votre sourire raconte.
Thank you, Dena. And your smile counts more than anything. Amir,
revenir vers vous.
I'd like to get back to you. It's true that form is it's a whole, and there's a real balance. You already had that balance with the two reverse ensemble, which was hybrid and transcultural already, and you already got a real balance that is present in Luminescence as well. Or am I wrong?
I think we found a good balance, and I think this was interesting because as Vanessa noted, this was the first part of the first movement of the piece, and in a sense we're presenting musically, we're presenting two forms that are sort of fully formed, like the song that Dena and I are playing at the beginning. And I just want to give a brief explanation why this is rhythmically so challenging, is because the song that Dena and I are playing is a 10 rhythm that's very common. It's a folklore rhythm in Iraq and parts of Turkey and Iran and Kurdistan, but outside of that region, people aren't necessarily as familiar with the rhythm. It's 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3. It's in 10, and most rhythms in the world are usually in 3 or 4 or 2 or 6, or in the case of flamenco, many rhythms are in 12. So to do the transition between a rhythm that's in 10 and then a rhythm that's in boom raka kaka boom raka kaka kung raka kaka, which I think Pablo can do better representation of that rhythm, but that's the basic form of it. So where's the link in the subdivision? How do we translate one to the other? So in this case, we're presenting a form and another form and juxtaposing them and trying to create a smooth wave between them. And that's different from what happens later in the show when the forms begin to dissolve and disintegrate and then become reintegrated into something else. And that's part of the excitement of this process to me, is that it's kind of how we rehearsed. From the beginning, we all came in with our forms, with our things that we know, and gradually those started to melt away. And by the end of our rehearsal process, we were creating a new vocabulary and a new mode of expression collectively. And in that sense, everybody's a co-creator in this project, all 6 members. And so in later parts of the piece, it's no longer so clear cut. This is maqâm, this is flamenco, this is, it becomes more melted together. So, and I like that in our 1 hour performance of, that's the length of the Luminescence performance, that we have moments that represent kind of this is more or less traditional, and then other moments where it's much more ambiguous. So.
Merci beaucoup, Amir ElSaffar.
Thank you, Amir ElSaffar. I'd like to thank all of your team,
Gema Caballero,
Lorenzo Bianchi Hoesch, Pablo Martín Jones, Dena ElSaffar, Vanesa Aibar, and Vincent Maillet, who was not here today, but he was here in spirit. I'd like to thank their artists for being here with us and for the presentation of the creation. I hope that we will one day see this on stage to take advantage of all of those vibrations and waves that will transport us. Thank you to everyone. Thanks to the Royaumont Foundation and to the Quai Branly Museum and all the technical teams for having made this possible. I'd like to thank the talent and the commitment of all of the artists. And I'd like to say that we'll see each other soon. Thank you.
Merci.
Gracias.